The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a major burden for the transatlantic relationship, which has just revived after the election of President Joe Biden last November. What is the state of affairs in the transatlantic relationship 1 year after, and what are expectations of the public on both sides of the Atlantic? In cooperation with the Pew Research Center, we have once again conducted a joint transatlantic survey for the new 5th edition of our Berlin Pulse, Körber Foundation's annual flagship publication. And I'm delighted that I'm now joined by James Bell, Vice President of Global Strategy from Washington, D.C., for a presentation of results. Welcome, James, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's both a privilege and an honor to be with you again. And I just want to say on behalf of my colleagues at the Pew Research Center how much we appreciate being able to join Körber-Stiftung yet again for a wonderful partnership exploring public opinion on both sides of the transatlantic relationship in terms of what's ahead of us and trying to understand what public opinion may tell us about the possibilities for the future. Thanks.
The pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much for the cooperation. And we will today not only present you some of the key transatlantic results, but you will also have the opportunity to live vote some of the questions that we asked in the Berlin Pulse yourself. So we want to know, what does the Berlin community thinks when it comes to public opinion, and also the community and our viewers all around the world. On the conference platform, please make sure that you're in the right session with a live voting tool to the right of the video stream to take part in the polling. Before we start, let us first take a look at the consequences of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, James, for the transatlantic relationship.
Yes, so in terms of what people may have read in newspapers, seen on television, the general reporting on the U.S. withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, I think it's very reasonable for people to have gotten the impression that this could be a moment of very strong negative reaction, especially among allied publics, towards the United States and how it handled the affair in Afghanistan. And yet it's very interesting to see how Germans and Americans view whether they're aligned on the matter of Afghanistan. And it's actually not the case in Germany, for example, that the overwhelming response or view is negative today. In fact, it's about half saying we do believe that we are aligned on Afghanistan. And for Americans, even more so. This is not to disregard the substantial minority, roughly 4 in 10 in Germany, that are skeptical about that alignment. But it's not the moment necessarily we thought it might be in terms of how the news media was reporting it, in terms of how the publics are seeing the relationship around the issue of Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Afghanistan seems to remain an area of cooperation rather than conflict in the transatlantic relationship. And I think beyond Afghanistan, the question very much was, after the election of President Biden, whether transatlantic relations will recover or whether they are irreparably damaged. And this is also our first live voting question, because we have asked the German and the US public what they think about the state of the transatlantic relationship. Please get ready for the first live vote on this question. We would like to know, how would you rate the current relationship between Germany and the United States? The polling starts now, and you have 2 options, quite easy, either good or bad. You have now 60 seconds to vote. How would you rate the current relationship between Germany and the United States? And afterwards, we will present to you the results from our representative survey, so that we have a little bit of an impression what the foreign policy community thinks in comparison to the general public in Germany and the United States. And I guess, without revealing the results, James, we are probably rather optimistic, right?
I think so. Pew Research Center did some polling earlier in this year, And the indications are there has been some changes in attitudes in multiple countries towards the United States now that there's a new administration in office. So I'll be very curious to see what our audience says and to compare it with what you at Körber and we at Pew found this fall.
Yeah, you have a few more seconds to vote, dear audience. The question is, how would you rate the current relationship between Germany and the United States, as good or as bad? And the polling will close now in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have a few seconds until our technical team will present us the results from our live audience. And again, let me remind you that our representative survey for the Berlin Pulse in cooperation with the Pew Research Center was conducted in September and October this year, obviously with a representative number of persons questioned. Here's the result. Our online audience thinks that 75% think that the relationship is rather in a good state, and 75% think it's a good state, and 25% think it's rather bad. That is almost the same as our representative results. If we look at the results from the Berlin Pulse, we can see that this is very similar. And I think for the German respondents, it's very interesting that we are also at more than 70%, 71% think the relationship is good. And we very clearly see the shift in November from very bad to very good. And in the US, it has been always quite good, right, James?
Yes, so one of the things that I would note as a longtime public opinion researcher on these kinds of questions is that this question often reflects an assessment by citizens of whether there are tensions in a relationship or not. For Americans, they have not perceived tensions now for a good while, as you just indicated, Liana. But you can see, as you pointed out, the dramatic shift among Germans in their assessment of whether there are tensions in the relationship, whether relations are good. And yeah, the sea change is dramatically illustrated in this chart.
And let's also have a look at another question that we asked, namely our most important partner question, which especially for the German part has a very interesting result, which was also prominently featured in the media yesterday and today, namely that the US has overtaken France again as Germany's most important partner. Would you like to comment on the US result, James?
Yes, so obviously the result for Germany is dramatic and eye-catching. I personally think the result for the United States part of this chart is also a bit surprising, maybe, in the sense that the view of the UK, the United Kingdom, as the most important partner for the United States is only strengthening over time in the poll that we've done together with Körber. And that's not necessarily something you would predict, because there was a lot of questions about where the UK was headed in its foreign relations and status on the world stage. For Americans, it's still the most important partner, far ahead of the other countries, including Germany, in terms of who Americans see as consequential in their foreign policy.
And I think one specific area where the US and Europe have pledged greater cooperation is the digital sphere. The first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council took place in Pittsburgh in September. We have asked the German and the US public what they think what the digital transformation means for their societies. And that is also the second question that we put out in our live voting. The question goes, is an increasingly digital world a threat or an opportunity for democracy around the world? The polling starts now and you have the chance to cast your vote. Is it an opportunity for democracy, or is an increasingly digital world a threat for democracy? How was the Trade and Technology Council perceived in the US, James? Did it get a lot of attention?
It received some attention in the news media. I don't think it was the most high-profile event. Many things have been happening in the United States, as you know, in terms of attracting public attention, in terms of what's happening in the political realm. But I recall our survey of a few years ago where we found, that trade and the kind of economic relationship between Germany and the United States is something that Americans really put at front and center of the bilateral relationship. And in that sense, I think it's interesting that that's an area of potential continuing cooperation, maybe increased cooperation between the countries.
And we will also discuss this in our afternoon session on the geopolitics of the digital transformation. A few more seconds, you can now still cast your vote, and the polling will close now. So we will see in a few seconds the results from our audience, and we will again compare it with the results of our representative survey for the Berlin Pulse. Is an increasingly digital world a threat or an opportunity for democracy around the world? What do you think? What does the live audience here think? And what does the German and the US public think? Here are the results. 45% see it as an opportunity for democracy. 55% of our audience members see it as a threat for democracy. And if I'm not mistaken, this is a little bit less optimistic than the German and the US public were, right? Let's have a look at our results. Yes, Germans were more optimistic. 51% saw an increasingly digital world as an opportunity, and US respondents were even more optimistic.
Yes, I think it's interesting that our audience is a little more skeptical or concerned, and it's the public, in our polling overall tends to, at an individual level, feel I can manage whatever comes at me in terms of maybe fake news, disinformation, and yet there's concern for society as a whole. And I think you see that in the public numbers here. And very interesting that our audience is actually expressing greater concern about what the digital transformation means for democracy. Fascinating.
And let's also have a look at one of the other great transformations apart from the digital transformation, namely the fight against the climate crisis. This was also part of our survey with not a very particular pleasant result for the United States, right?
There's some real doubts here among Germans about what the United States is committed to doing to help reduce global warming, combat climate change. I have to say, this is fairly consistent with previous polls, even earlier this year, that Pew conducted in Germany and other countries, where there is a lot of dissatisfaction with how much the United States is committed to doing or already doing to combat climate change. Now, I just want to add that may be the majority view, that they're not happy with what the United States is doing, but there was a tremendous enthusiasm as the Biden administration took office for the United States rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, for example. So I think in a way, this question that is in the survey by Körber is really right on. How committed is the United States? Will it see through its pledges? I think Germans and probably others are looking to see what are the results of American action.
And it's also interesting against the background of the result that Thomas Paulsen presented today morning, that climate change is seen as the greatest challenge for German foreign policy. Now, let's have a look at what the COVID-19 pandemic means for international cooperation. That's a question that we've already asked last year and that we want to repeat this year. And again, this is a question that we would like to ask you, our virtual audience, on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. What would you expect once the COVID-19 crisis is over? Our third live voting question, and the polling starts now, with 3 options to answer. First, states will increase their focus on national interests. Second, everything will be the same as before the crisis. And third, states will cooperate more. Please cast your vote now. What would you expect once the COVID-19 crisis is over? And if we look back, James, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there really was a breakdown of multilateral cooperation, if we can put it this way, which to some extent has improved, at least in the transatlantic sphere. We just had in November restrictions on travels released for the first time. It's again possible to travel easily between the United States and Germany and Europe.
Yes, and I went back and checked our numbers from a year ago. And when we asked at Pew about whether international cooperation, more international cooperation, would have reduced the loss of life in one's own country, actually, in the height of the pandemic, before vaccines came on board, Germans were skeptical that international cooperation would have made a difference. They were kind of thinking it wouldn't have. They were clearly not thinking it would not have, whereas Americans thought more international cooperation would have helped. So I'll be interested to see what our audience says and then compare it to this year's results, because I think there's some interesting elements here in how attitudes are changing.
Let's see what the audience thinks. You have a few more seconds. What would you expect once the COVID-19 crisis is over? More focus on national interests, more cooperation, or everything will be the same as before the crisis? And again, the polling closes now. We'll wait a moment until we get the results. And let's also remember that our audience is from all around the world, so we get a glimpse into the opinion of a foreign policy, security policy-minded community from all around the world compared with the result of the German and the US public here from our representative survey for the Berlin Pulse 21-22. In a few seconds, we will get the results. Here they are. Okay, we see again a rather pessimistic take from our audience here today. 48% say that states will increase their focus on national interests once the COVID-19 crisis is over, whereas exactly 26% and 26% say it will be the same as before and states will cooperate more. Let's have a look at what our representative results say. Here we had Germany with 50% assuming that Germany will cooperate more, and the US with 40% assuming that everything will be the same as before the crisis. A little bit less optimistic than the Germans here.
Yes. I go back to the audience results. I mean, that's worth conversation today in the forum about this, I guess would say, concern, or as you said, Liana, maybe a bit of pessimism about national interests actually surging after the pandemic. But in the public results that we see from Germany and the United States, different worldviews, one observation. The second is, among Americans, I think it's still uncertain. These percentages aren't overwhelming in any one direction, although they lean more towards going back to how things were. And I just wonder, a question among Germans, could it be that they saw the pandemic period as kind of a low point in international cooperation? And now, as you were saying, there are signs that maybe cooperation, borders are opening, that there's a blossoming again of international cooperation. It's fascinating, something to track as we go forward.
Absolutely. And before we conclude, let's also have a look at the more difficult countries to cooperate with. We also asked a question on what China and Russia do in international cooperation. More concretely, we asked whether China or Russia represent a major, a minor threat, or no threat to German-American values, with quite differing results.
Yes. Again, a contrast in worldviews among Germans and Americans, and perhaps no surprise, we live in different neighborhoods, and to some degree we have different historical and evolving relationships with these countries. I would emphasize that we've seen a trend, even in Germany, as well as other parts of Europe, towards more negative or unfavorable views of China, and there's tremendous doubt about Putin, for example, and his leadership in Russia, in the United States and Germany, both. Yet, when it comes to defining either one of those countries as a threat, that is obviously, as you see in these results, more part of the narrative in the United States among the American public than it is among Germans. And that's where the difference in the worldview is very interesting to note.
And it also reflects an assessment that many foreign and security politicians and experts have here in Berlin, that Germany, to some extent, still feels a little bit safe within the European Union, surrounded by friends, although there are a lot of fires surrounding the European Union and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Those were our results from this year's Berlin Pulse 2021-2022. Thank you so much, James, for being here with us and for presenting those results, and as always, for the wonderful cooperation.
The same. So happy to be part of this partnership, and best of luck with the rest of the forum. This is a tremendously important event.
Thank you, James, and we hope these results will inspire some of your thinking. We also hope these results will inspire some of the discussions at the Berlin Forum today. If you want to know more, check out www.theberlinpulse.org for the 5th edition of the Berlin Pulse, or get your personal copy at one of our future events, hopefully soon.